Hi, I'm Craig Keener. I have a grayer and bigger beard than I did in some earlier videos, but that's because I'm talking about the Old Testament instead of the New Testament, and therefore I needed to look a little bit older. Please don't compare me with Santa Claus. I don't have as much weight as Santa Claus did. But today we're talking about the tabernacle. Sometimes when people start reading the book of Exodus, they really enjoy reading about Moses and maybe the plagues and maybe the giving of the law. And then they start slowing down as they're reading some of the laws. And then they get to the tabernacle in Exodus 25, and they're like, let's go on to the next book. Oh, that's Leviticus. Let's go on to the next book. Anyway, the tabernacle actually is very interesting. But there was a time in my life when I was like, what is this in the Bible for? And some of the expositions I heard didn't make any sense. They were all based on symbolic interpretations that were kind of guesses that people had made. So I felt like when I was praying, like what would help me understand this better, that I should go research ancient Near Eastern temples and see how the Israelites in their ancient Near Eastern North African context would have understood the tabernacle and the point, the theology that it was meant to communicate to them. So the tabernacle was God's temporary dwelling place with his people in the wilderness, the precursor of Solomon's temple. Why record it in such detail? Well, believe it or not, this was of great interest to ancient audiences. So, for example, the Canaanites were really excited about, in the Epic of Baal, their god Baal, his his heavenly sanctuary was like the earthly one. Their earthly temple was modeled, they thought, on the heavenly one. Sometimes the ancient people said that gods gave them revelations about how to build a temple. Well, in Exodus 25:8, God actually gives his people such instructions. But it's going to be a bit different from what we see in some other ancient Near Eastern temples. The tabernacle, this isn't an actual picture of the tabernacle, it's just a picture of a tent. I wanted to use pictures that were free. But anyway, the tabernacle was nothing like the Temple of Solomon in terms of its size, but it was pretty big for people having to put together something in the wilderness. The outer court was obviously the biggest part, 150 by 75 feet, but it was very expensive for people in the wilderness. I mean, it would take a lot of their earrings and so on. 3.8 tons of silver were used in it. Now, that wasn't much by the standard of Egyptian temples, the kind that maybe the Israelites had been forced to build when they were slaves, but it was pretty big for people traveling in the wilderness. The size of the tabernacle was more like Canaanite temples from the Middle Bronze period, but smaller than most Canaanite temples, way smaller than Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Hittite temples. But that's because it's portable. You have to be able to carry it around in the wilderness. But the proportions fit other temples, even Egyptian temples. Multiples of 10 fit Egyptian practice. There was a dissertation by James Atwood Scott, I believe it is, I think University of Pennsylvania in the 1960s that talked about some of this. Well, are the amounts of sacrifice incredible? Well, they're limited, but again, these are pastoralists. They're uh, semi-nomadic at this point, or even nomadic while they're traveling in the wilderness. And they reflect the size of the tabernacle and the wilderness people's resources. Compare with this the offerings of the Theban temples of Ramses II or Ramses III, where they offered 5,500 loaves of bread daily. So, I mean, the tabernacle in the wilderness, some people say, that's too much. They couldn't have had those kind of sacrifices. By ancient standards, actually, it was pretty reasonable. By comparison, that's like comparing a gourmet meal with my cooking. Uh, I can make peanut butter sandwiches. Anyway, so let's look at Egyptian architecture as background, since the Israelites came out of Egypt, at least for those of us who actually believe that an exodus happened. So the tabernacle, some take its features as symbols, like blue represents heaven and red represents the blood of Jesus. Ah, there's very important theology in the blood of Jesus, but we're talking about how it would have been understood, first of all, by the Israelites and their generation. So the number of cubits, sometimes people said that's the number of years until Jesus would come. Look, we don't know what year the tabernacle was built, so that one really doesn't make any sense. But let's try instead by comparing it with ancient Near Eastern temples. Ramses apparently used Israelite slaves to build many of the temples in the Delta region. Well, assuming it's Ramses, actually, there's been some other evidence that makes me think maybe it was a much earlier pharaoh, even though figuring out how they were in the Delta region. Anyway, let's just say whoever it was, Israelites knew what an Egyptian temple looked like. And some features of the tabernacle are probably just to connect with Israel so they understand, okay, this is a temple. It's a portable one, but it's a temple. Everybody understood that the God worshipped in a temple wasn't limited to the temple. Egyptian temples often painted the ceiling blue with stars and a vulture god. Well, there you have the blue, to symbolize their deity's rule over the cosmos. Babylonians and Canaanites modeled their earthly temples on what they thought the deity's heavenly temple looked like. The tabernacle structure follows the standard Egyptian model. Mesopotamian temples, they kind of zigzagged all over the place to get back to the holiest place in the back of the temple. But Egyptian temples followed the pattern of royal palaces. So you approach through the outer court, straight back through the sanctuary, and into the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, the holiest sanctuary. And Ramses II, and this probably was true of many other pharaohs, I just happened to see it for Ramses, but his tent was in the center of a rectangular camp during military expeditions. Makes sense because he was considered divine by his people. So in the center of Israel's rectangular camp is the tabernacle for the true and the living God. So the structure of the tabernacle was tripartite. That follows Egyptian models, has some Canaanite parallels, very different from Mesopotamian temples, which to me helps suggest that the ideas for it came from before the exile rather than after the exile, which when some people date it. But not to be technical, just moving on. This is adapted from what you had. So the temples were built like in Egypt, were built like royal palaces and upper class homes. The houses of deities were modeled on those of kings. That's why when um, Joseph, he tries to avoid Potiphar's wife, but he doesn't have a whole lot of choice because as a slave, he's working in the outer part of the house, but the storeroom that he's in charge of, he has to go to the back of the house. So the tripartite structure actually existed in Egypt for a long time. Now, the inner shrine in Egyptian temples could be a holy of holies. It was called the holiest place. It was to be shut off from the profane light of the world. That was true of Mesopotamian temples also. The innermost sanctuary was to be secluded from the profane light of the world. The further from the innermost sanctuary, the more light you got. Now, these features were true of Egyptian temples as early as the Archaic period, and this was true of all ancient Near Eastern and North African temples that we know about. There's a progression of holiness toward the inner shrine. Now, what about them using a tent shrine? Was that acceptable? Well, Egyptians actually would have figured that that was acceptable. The biggest parallels to it are for nomadic peoples, including in Arabia, the Kaaba. much later than this period as well. But Egypt used prefabricated tent shrines, again, as early as the Archaic and Old Kingdom period for royal corpses. Canopy poles have been recovered from Egyptian tomb chapels from the 29th century BC onward, and that continued into the Middle and New Kingdoms and well beyond that. So the Israelites would have understood that this was acceptable for a small, portable kind of temple. An Egyptian temple to Hathor, the goddess of mining, in Timnah, where they had people doing mining for them, cloth pieces have been found. Canaanites also would have understood this because they spoke of their chief, well, it wasn't their favorite deity, that was Baal, but the chief of the Canaanite pantheon was called El, and all the deities together were called Elohim, the 70 Elohim. So Canaanites spoke of the tent of El on his holy mountain. Well, no shrines of El have ever been recovered, so maybe they actually used tent shrines for El. The building techniques all follow those used in Egypt at that time. The construction methods, materials, and so forth, the ways that they refined gold, multiples for cubits, tent shrines, skills, implements, and materials were all known in Egypt. These techniques had been used for up to 15 centuries by the time the tabernacle was built. And here, I'm depending on that dissertation I mentioned earlier, but also on some other works, Forbes on ancient technology, K.A. Kitchen on his Egyptological work, and so on. Materials used for building the tabernacle. Well, there was a lot of wealth available in the Eastern Delta in the 13th century BC, or whenever this was. So when the Egyptians gave them gifts as the Israelites were leaving Egypt, they had some resources, and many other resources were available in the Sinai Peninsula, including flax and goat hair, dye stuffs, ram skins, and dolphin skins were the most accessible types of leather for them. Materials to preserve and tan them were also available. Goat's hair has been used on Bedouin tents even in modern times. Typically, it's dark brown. It shrinks and thickens when wet, so it's really helpful in bad weather. The term used for goat's hair in Exodus comes from an old Egyptian root. The skins would be soaked, dried outside, then pulled back and forth over wooden or metal blade on a stake to keep it from being stiff. That's what I need. Anyway, but we're going to get to the theology of it soon. I'm just giving some of the backdrop so you see why I kind of date the tabernacle earlier than some other people do and think it actually reflects actual historical instructions and not something that was made up centuries later. Why does the tabernacle use acacia wood? Well, often that was used for building in Egypt. Also, the combustibility, it burns only at high temperatures, so it's useful in altars. But also, it shows us something about God's care for details, because it's very practical in that it's probably about the only kind of wood that grows in the Sinai desert. The metals used. Bronze had been regularly used in Egypt after 1600 BC. Gold overlay over wood, like you have in the tabernacle. Egyptians were famous for this skill. Only the mercy seat and the lampstand were of pure gold. Those are too delicate for overlay. Now, when they talk about pure gold, it wasn't fully refined until the Persian period. Pure didn't mean completely refined, but it meant natural gold in this period, meant natural gold that was like 72 to 99% pure. A lot of other gold had a lot of copper in it, so it wasn't like completely pure gold. But the purest gold that was available in that period. Dyes were available in Egypt. Red was pretty common. I was talking with my daughter about the coconut insect dye. She said it's still used today. I'm not sure if I want to eat stuff with that in it. But anyway, uh, red was very common dye. Blue was available, but it was limited until Hellenistic times, so it was very expensive. Purple, now that was from mollusks, the murex shellfish. That was especially imported from Tyre. And you had to, basically, the way you got the dye, you would crush the shellfish, and the purple dye would be squeezed out of them. But you had to crush thousands of these shellfish to get enough even to dye a robe, which is why my robe isn't purple. So you crush all these shellfish to make this purple dye. It's going to be very expensive because of all the shellfish you had to crush. It also stank. What do you expect with mollusk guts? But having said that, it was a status symbol, so people like to have it. So you do have some of these dyes available in various quantities. Well, what do the blue, red, and also the various metals represent in the tabernacle? It was customary to put the costliest materials and dyes nearest an inner sanctuary. So you have blue dye and pure gold nearest the Ark of the Covenant. And you have skins dyed red, and you have copper utensils furthest from the Ark of the Covenant. This was meant in an ancient Near Eastern and North African context, it was meant to symbolize the awesomeness and holiness of the deity, hence the reverence with which one should approach that deity. So God giving instructions like this would be understood in an ancient Near Eastern setting as saying, approach me with awe and reverence. And of course, Moses was the only one who could go in all the way at that point, and the high priest once a year. Why the different items of furniture in the tabernacle? Well, altars of sacrifice provided a way to show allegiance to a deity in a costly way, to show you are really committed to this deity. And when you burn flesh, you have to have altars of incense too, because sometimes the burning of the flesh didn't smell real good in a closed space. Usually in the ancient Near East, these altars had 4 horns, just like the altar, the Israelite altars did. Inner sanctuaries also had to have lampstands, because remember, they're secluded from the profane light of the world. You don't want to be tripping all over the place while you're trying to offer sacrifices. So priests have to be able to see. You need lampstands. And lamps with 7 wicks have been found from the Bronze and Iron Age. And I'd love to digress and talk about the lampstands in the book of Revelation, but that'll be for different presentation. The ark, other temples had a sacred bark in the holiest place, not like the bark of a dog, not like the bark of a tree, but although the Kermes oak did provide red dye in Asia Minor, at least in a later period. But getting back to the point of the bark, they would have like a sacred boat or something in some ancient temples. And so they would have that in the holiest place. But atop it, in other ancient Near Eastern temples, with maybe some exceptions in Syria or Aram around the 8th century BCE, but that may have been due to Israelite influence, but I'm sure that will rouse a debate. So let me just step back from that. But in most ancient Near Eastern temples, you had the image of a deity on top, what was the equivalent of the ark in these other temples. But notice there's no image in the temple of the true God. There are reasons for that we'll talk about. The ark is viewed as a throne, and that was true for a lot of ark-like things in holy places and sanctuaries in the ancient Near East. Well, often in the Old Testament, we read about God being enthroned above the cherubim being on the ark, and things shaped like cherubim, winged creatures, were often used as throne pedestals throughout the ancient Near East. So it makes sense. God's ark has these cherubim It's a throne pedestal. God is enthroned on the cherubim, but there's no image there. God wants to show himself. God shows himself without needing artistic representations of it. By the way, um, my understanding is the Bible doesn't speak against artistic representations, just speaks against artistic representations of God. So I draw cartoons. But anyway, but these parallel, I actually, when I was a student, I used to draw cartoons when I was taking notes. One day, one of my professors walked by and saw me drawing cartoons, but I was paying attention. But these parallels make the contrasts all the starker. Other ancient Near Eastern and North African temples had a chest of drawers and a bed, so the god could be put to sleep at night, then dressed in the morning and given his or her morning toilet. There's none of this in the temple of the true God. For as Psalm 121 tells us, the God of Israel never slumbers nor sleeps. They would have tables of offering. Well, you have that in God's temple. You have that in Assyrian and Hittite and Minoan temples. But in Israel, priests and not a god eat the food. God was not a material God, and he wasn't dependent on the people for their sacrifices. Sacrifices were for the people to show their commitment to God. But as he says in Psalm 50, look, the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. If I wanted one, I wouldn't ask you. I would just take it. So I'm not reproving you for your sacrifices, he says in Psalm 50. Sacrificial altars. Elsewhere in the ancient Near East, it was understood thank offerings, sin offerings, atonement offerings, and offerings you could vow. Well, you do have analogies for that in Israel's temple to show that we should thank God, to show that sin has to be atoned for. But you had no arm twisting offerings. Like in a lot of ancient Near Eastern temples, the god or goddess would make it rain. Baal would make it rain. And you would give sacrifices to persuade the god to make it rain. Look, I did this, I did that. You need to make it rain. God says, you keep my covenant. You take care of the needy. Deuteronomy 15. I'll take care of you. So I'll give you the rain. You just do what I told you. Some other ancient Near Eastern temples had smaller shrines for tutelary deities on either side of the holiest place. But God doesn't need assistant gods helping him out. He says, you shall have no other gods in my sight. The climax of all other ancient Near Eastern temples was a statue of the deity on top of the throne in the holiest place. But enthroned above the cherubim in God's temple is no image. God says, make no graven image of me. So these contrasts with other ancient Near Eastern temples, the parallels, they show us, okay, this is a temple. The contrasts teach us the tabernacle's theology, which is pretty close in line with the Ten Commandments, right? Contextualization. God used the culture of their day to relate to the Israelites. If he was spoken a cosmic wind, who would understand? But he speaks in language that they understand. God required changes where the culture reflected idolatrous misunderstandings of his character. And that provides us models for contextualizing too. We relate to the forms of our culture, but we communicate God's message without compromising his message. The tabernacle's religious significance. Similarities? Well, the earthly reflects the heavenly prototype. So in the Baal epic, or in Babylonia, Marduk's Esagila, these temples were supposedly modeled on the heavenly dwelling of the deity to, make it feel comfortable. The deity wants to come dwell here on earth with you because it's like, it's a representation of the cosmic rule of the deity. So similarities. Temples often signified the deity's cosmic dominion. So just because God is present in the tabernacle doesn't mean he's not present anywhere else. But God says, I'll be with you in a special way. Again, Egyptian temples, the blue ceiling studded with gold stars with a vulture goddess spreading wings over it. that was showing this dominion of the deity. Well, God shows his dominion in ways that the Israelites could understand, but no vulture goddess, and probably no stars either. Gradation of holiness. The most expensive dyes and metals were used nearest the ark. Pure blue was used to cover the ark. Other vessels with blue, purple for the copper utensils. Red was used for the tabernacle. If extra, some people say the extra skins were used only for bad weather, but in any case, the outside, in bad weather at least, was ram skins dyed red, or porpoise skins dyed red. I actually forget, was it ram skins or porpoise skins? Look it up. This is free. You're not paying me to do this. All right, so pure gold for the furniture, but regular gold for planks used for the structure of the tabernacle. So the fabrics decrease in value further away from the ark. So do the metals. This fits an ancient Near Eastern symbolism showing the gradation of holiness again. Approach the deity with awe and reverence because the deity is holy. So those are some similarities with other ancient Near Eastern temples where God is contextualizing, but you also have contrasts with these other temples. Elsewhere, the sacred bark would hold the image of the deity. That would be the climax of other ancient Near Eastern shrines. And also they would have additional shrines for assistant deities. In terms of ritual, Egyptian and Hittite temples, you'd awaken the image of the deity with a hymn of praise, give him or her, give it its morning toilet, perfume it, clothe it, feed it, bring it out to decide cases. There they would put it on the shoulders of the priests, and if the answer was no, they would move like that. If it was yes, they might move like that, if their gestures were like our gestures. And they would therefore bring it out to decide cases and acknowledge the gifts. And then they'd give it its afternoon nap or entertain it with dancers and an evening meal, which the priests may have eaten in secret or may have just been burned in the sacrifices. But anyway, then they would put it back to bed at night. But remember, no bed and no chest of drawers for God's clothes in God's temple. It's not so anthropomorphic. God keeps reminding us he is beyond these things that other people were worshiping. This is now this is not the outer darkness of wailing and gnashing of teeth. This is inside the tabernacle if you don't have the lampstands on. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you'll click like or subscribe or do something, at least smile, and I'll try as I have time between teaching, advising doctoral students in New Testament and writing books as I try to produce videos here and there. Thanks for watching.